Hi, Vadim here, and on the screen is KALEIDOSCOPE, a 4-track digital multi-timbral synthesizer for creating generative music. In this video, I will show you 10 features of the generative sequencer and control system of KALEIDOSCOPE. These parts are responsible for all the variety of possibilities of the synthesizer. They animate the static sound core. There is a separate video about the sound core on the channel. The features are arranged in order of complexity. The further I go, the more complex patches I will build and the more features I will combine. The features only expand the possibilities for synthesis and creating effects. If you discard them, KALEIDOSCOPE will turn out to be just a good general-purpose synthesizer with its own digital character. Get ready, I'm about to show you what the KALEIDOSCOPE can do that other synthesizers can't. Let's go! How to control the KALEIDOSCOPE? In the KALEIDOSCOPE, everything is a parameter and there are no hidden menus. By changing the parameters, you control the instrument. In the KALEIDOSCOPE, all parameters are located on pages. The page selector is responsible for selecting pages, 8 groups of 4 pages each. Then switching groups, the display shows the names of all pages within the group. The currently selected page is highlighted by inverted brightness. Each page contains 4 parameters. Each parameter is controlled by its own encoder. The screen displays the values of each parameter for all 4 tracks at once. You select a track by holding the track selector and rotate the encoder to change the parameter value. If you select several tracks, then the rotation will change the parameter of all selected tracks. If you don't select any track, then the rotation will not change any parameters. This KALEIDOSCOPE feature works with all parameters on all pages. In the Western musical system, the octave is divided into 12 semitones, and a change by an octave corresponds to doubling the frequency. The KALEIDOSCOPE encoder is designed so that when you turn it by one click, it changes the parameter by 1 unit. For example, the frequency changes by 1 semitone. I'll show you using the tune parameter. Rotation of the pressed encoder changes the value by 12 units. Therefore, the frequency changes by an octave. But the same thing happens with the filter frequency, which is tuned to the frequencies of MIDI notes. To demonstrate this, I'll create a sawtooth sound and boost the filter resonance to bring out the resonant sound. I can change the resonance frequency with semitone precision. I can also change the resonance frequency by octave just by rotating the pressed encoder. Similarly, the comb filter delay is set to MIDI note frequencies. By changing the delay length, I change the frequency of the sound with semitone precision, but I can also change the frequency by octaves. KALEIDOSCOPE has an ADSR volume envelope on each track, which controls the amplitude of the signal. KALEIDOSCOPE has 4 AD general-purpose modulation envelopes. All 8 envelopes can be used to modulate the parameters of the synthesizer. Each envelope at the end of its attack-decay cycle generates an end-of-cycle trigger. This trigger can launch any envelope of the same type. For example, volume envelope 1 triggers volume envelope 2. This is controlled by the link parameter on the envelope sequencer page. This parameter determines to which envelopes the end-of-cycle trigger will be sent. End-of-cycle parameter turns this feature on or off. If the envelope triggers itself, it turns into a kind of low-frequency oscillator. It's much more convenient from a musical point of view to control not the attack and decay of the envelope separately, but to control its period, which is done in KALEIDOSCOPE. To control the ratio of the attack speed to the decay speed, there is a shape parameter. The period doesn't change, only the shape of the envelope changes. Then shape is equal to half, the attack and decay are equal to each other. A very cool little thing that you might not even notice. But if the neighboring voice is not currently being used and the volume envelope passes its end-of-cycle trigger, then it's not only launches the envelope, but also passes it its node. Such linking of envelopes can be used for different purposes, for example, FM synthesis. There will be a separate video about using FM, so subscribe to the channel, and I'll show you how it sounds. In KALEIDOSCOPE, you will never lose the rhythm and dynamics of the voices, then changing the BPM. Because the period and shape of the envelope are tied to the current BPM and are automatically adjusted by the synthesizer, then it changes. Also, the period values correspond to the lengths of the notes: 8ths, 16ths, triplets, pentols, dotted notes, and other. You can easily create polyrhythms. Moreover, the periodicity will depend on the selected period durations. This topic will be discussed in detail in one of the future videos on the channel, KALEIDOSCOPE Generative Sequencer and how to use it. Subscribe and click to the bell so you don't miss it. The envelope period also follows the doubling rule for every 12 encoder clicks, just like the notes. Whatever the period length is, then changing by an octave, it will change by 2 times. 1/16th note will become 1/8th of a bar, 1/8th note will become 1/4th of the bar, and so on. Each envelope has an 8-step pattern mask with variable length. It's somewhat similar to a step sequencer, but from the other hand, it's a very unusual way to create envelopes with complex behavior over time while you hold them down. The pattern mask determines then the envelope acts on the volume or the assigned parameter and then only works in the shadow and does not act. Currently the pattern size is equal to 1. I increase the pattern size by 1 unit. Note how the cursor began to cycle through the pattern mask steps. I change the pattern by turning the encoder, changing it like a parameter, because an 8-bit pattern can have only 256 combinations. It would be difficult to do this with 16 steps. If you turn the pressed encoder, the pattern mask will shift. This is very convenient. Let's look at the example of two voices with cyclic volume envelopes. Each has its own pattern and attack-decay cycle period. You can use the sequencer to synthesize a drum pattern. To do this, I'll create a kick sound on track 1. I'll create a snare sound on track 2. And I'll create a percussion sound on track 3. The periods of the kick and snare volume envelopes are the same. They correspond to 1/8 of the bar. The patterns are different. The percussion period corresponds to 1/16 of the bar. The length of the kick pattern is 8 steps. The length of the snare pattern is 4 steps. The length of the percussion pattern is 2 steps. Now I will slow down all 3 sounds by 2 times by rotating the pressed encoder by 1 unit. Now I make the length of the percussion pattern equal to 3 steps. Eight steps is not enough to create some kind of variable rhythmic pattern. But instead of increasing the number of steps, KALEIDOSCOPE offers you another concept: modulation of the pattern, the length of the pattern, and the period of the envelope. Later in this video we will see what happens if we start modulating the pattern. Now I showed how the volume envelope pattern works. However, the modulation envelope has its own pattern mask, length, and envelope period. Let's add variability by creating a modulation of the kick sound. For example, I will modulate the filter to get a snare. We have the smooth kick drum that sounds in each of the 4 steps of its volume envelope pattern. The snare modulation envelope pattern has 4 steps, but the envelope only works on the 3rd. I increase the value of the modulation depth of the modulation envelope. By changing the frequency of the filter, due to which the synthesis of both the kick and the snare drum occurs, it's possible to significantly change the sound of both sounds. KALEIDOSCOPE has several modulation sources on each track. All of them are displayed in the bottom line of the KALEIDOSCOPE display. It's very convenient to see all the moving elements of the system in one place. Volume envelope, modulation envelope, key track smoothing, MIDI velocity envelope, aftertouch envelope, mod wheel, and pitch bend. In KALEIDOSCOPE, all modulation sources can modulate most parameters. That is, not only the sound core, but also the envelope period, pattern mask length, modulation depth, and even modulator quantization, which I will talk about later. But the most important thing is that you assign not only the parameter that will be modulated, but also the track to which this parameter belongs. The envelope of track 1 can modulate parameters not only on track 1, but also on track 2 or 3 or 4. In this sense, the KALEIDOSCOPE modulation system is more like a modular one than the usual multitimbral standalone synthesizers. Complete freedom. This makes it possible to create parametric sidechains and cross-modulation. I'll start with the kick drum. I assign the second destination of the volume envelope 1 to decrease the frequency of the filter of track 2. On the screen, you can see how the filter of track 2 closes synchronously with the movement of the volume envelope of track 1. Now I use the volume envelope 2, and I will assign it to modulate the period of the volume envelope of track 1. The other modulations remains unchanged. The kick continues to act on the filter of track 2. The screen shows how the period of the kick decreases with the growth of the volume envelope 2. Let's change the first destination of the volume envelope 2, and we will assign it not to the period, but to the value of the kick pattern. After all, this is also a parameter. The screen shows how the kick pattern changes under the influence of modulation. I'll assign the second destination of the volume envelope 2 to modulate the depth of the kick modulation. When I first tried this, I just expected to get different kicks with different punch. But in reality, we change the depth of modulation continuously. The shape of the pitch modulation of the kick becomes very complex. The kick acquires a characteristic sound, then someone scratches a finger on glass. Note that to create this patch we only used the destinations of the volume envelopes. Modulation envelope was not used at all. Using them, you can make the sound even more interesting. The kaleidoscope stores a huge number of unexpected and new sounds, mostly due to the openness of the modulation system. You can consider the kaleidoscope as 4 synthesizers in one case, or you can consider it as 4 modules from which you can assemble one complex and interesting timbre. The kaleidoscope is like a constructor. It allows you to freely use the modules as you wish. Few people use MIDI modulation sources to their full potential. To make them more attractive, I added a few features to the kaleidoscope for them. For example, you have not just MIDI velocity, but an attack hold release envelope. The force of your pressing on the key controls the modulation amplitude, taking into account the modulation depth value. I'll start with a simple sound similar to sine. Now the MIDI velocity parameter has 0 modulation depth, as well as the fastest rise and fall speeds. Let velocity envelope 1 modulate the mid parameter of track 1. This parameter is responsible for the oscillator waveform, which smoothly changes from a triangle to a saw. The screen shows how the mid parameter depends on pressing force. Now I will reduce the decay rate to get an envelope with a fast attack and slow decay. I did the same with the aftertouch, to which I added control over the rate of increase and decrease of the value. In Kaleidoscope, there is an assignable Keytrack. For example, it can be assigned to the frequency of the filter with resonance. You see that I changed the note, but the waveform doesn't change because the resonance frequency follows the notes of the keyboard. I can set the filter frequency in a certain interval from the main note, for example in a fifth. But if we can control the frequency, when the need to be able to control its glide? The Kaleidoscope Keytrack has rise and fall parameters, smoothing its rising and falling. Now the filter frequency will change not instantly but smoothly, creating a kind of glide for the resonance frequency. You can increase the glide time even more. Now we have a glide only for the filter frequency. Now I will also add a glide for the oscillator. I'll increase comb filter feedback. I really like this sound when I opened it. The resonance smoothly crawls along the spectrum, which smoothly changes under the influence of the oscillator glide. The timbre sounds very organic and diverse. Of course, several modulators can be assigned to the parameter to modulate it with a complex shape. Now I will show a sound in which only one parameter is modulated, the filter frequency, but it's modulated by 4 modulation sources at once. Now I will show how its modulation is arranged. Firstly, the volume envelope of track 1 modulates the filter frequency. On the screen you can see how the filter signal rises together with the volume envelope signal. Secondly, the modulation envelope of track 1 modulates the filter frequency. This envelope works in a cyclic mode. Using the end-of-cycle trigger, the volume envelope 1 starts the volume envelope 2 and also passes it its note, which is transposed down 1 octave by track 2. It turns out that track 2 works as sub-oscillator of track 1. The volume envelope of track 2 closes the filter of track 1. Additionally, I added Keytracking to this voice so that the unmodulated position of the filter resonance frequency is always at a fixed distance from the bass track harmonic. The modulation metrics page has a unique alias knob. It allows you to control exactly the parameter to which the modulator is assigned. This works for all destinations of all modulators. Since destination 1 of volume envelope 1 and 2 are assigned to the same parameter, filter frequency 1, they have the same alias parameter. You no longer need to remember where the destination parameter is, which track it belongs to, or switch between pages to adjust the basic value of the destination. The modulation envelope has an important feature that other modulation sources don't have, at least in the release version of the firmware: quantization. The output of the modulation envelope can be quantized, that is, made stepwise. What does this give? This makes it possible to create not only rhythmic but also parametric sequences. For example, to create a musical arpeggio. Now the modulation envelope 1 changes the frequency of track 1. By changing the quantization parameter, I turn the linear signal of the modulator into a step signal, and quantization changes the number of steps. But the arpeggiator will not be simple, because its speed depends on the envelope parameters. And its range depends on the attenuator of the modulation envelope. All parameters of the modulation envelope can be modulated: shape, period, depth, and quantized. You can create an arpeggiator not only for the oscillator frequency, but also for the filter frequency with resonance. I'll create a saw sound, and I'll make the resonance cycle through the harmonics that are an octave apart. You can assign a modulator to the delay length of the comp filter. To do this, I'll create a kick drum sound and set its pattern. I'll increase the feedback of comp filter 1. We hear the kick drum as well as several of its reflections in the comp filter. For the modulation envelope, I'll increase the modulation depth. You can hear now the kick drum reflections have acquired complex behavior due to the constant change in delay length. I also added feedback modulation, so that when delay time decreases, the feedback increases. I'll set the modulator quantization to 12 steps. And since the delay lengths of the comp filter double for every 12 units, the modulator changes the delay length only in powers of 2, which gives a fairly smooth rhythmic pattern. Now you can play on the rhythmic pattern of the sound by changing the shape of the modulation envelope. I'll add overdrive, which is located behind the output of the comp filter. You can support the project by sharing this video with your synth friends. In the comments you can ask me questions about Kaleidoscope. I am grateful for any feedback. Subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss new videos about Kaleidoscope. To order Kaleidoscope, you need to sign up for the waiting list using the link in the description. Thank you for your attention and see you soon.